Too often, the UFO phenomenon is dismissed for its supposed exclusive reliance on eyewitness testimony. However, there are numerous examples of UFO encounters that have left tangible traces of their presence in the physical environment or on the witnesses themselves. The so-called Cash-Landrum Case of 1980 is a notable example of the latter, having left all three of its witnesses with symptoms of severe radiation poisoning following a late-night encounter with an unidentified flying object. It is one case, at least, that cannot possibly be dismissed as a fabrication, a misidentification, or a hallucination, and one that points to a possible connection between the UFO phenomenon and the US government. On December 29, 1980, 52-year-old Betty Cash was driving down a rural road from New Caney to Huffman, Texas, with her neighbor, Vicki Landrum, 57, and Vicki's grandson, Colby, age 7. Between 9 and 9:15 p.m., following a compulsion to look out into the night sky, Colby noticed a light over the road ahead. After driving closer, the car's occupants noticed the presence of a brilliantly lit, vertically elongated object floating an estimated 60 to 80 feet above the center of the road, roughly at treetop level. They compared its size to that of a water tower, a common sight in rural Texas. The closer they got to the object, the more radiant heat they felt coming from its direction. Betty drove the car within 130 feet, then slammed on the brakes. The car was so hot by this point that Vicki's hands sank into the melting dashboard as she braced herself for the sudden stop. Betty got out of the car and stood in awe before the brilliant object ahead of her. Vicki, who believed that the blinding light was a sign of the return of Christ, stood behind an open door on the right side of the car, then climbed back into the vehicle at the assistance of a panicked Colby. None of the three witnesses were able to determine the shape or structure of the object due to the brilliance of the light it emitted, though they thought it might have had 4 points like a diamond. The object made a strong roaring noise that the witnesses compared to the passing of a freight train. They could also hear a deafening, shrill beeping noise. Incredibly, the object was shooting flames from its underside and bobbing up and down in the sky every time it fired a burst. After watching the object for 5 to 7 minutes, Betty turned to get back in the car, and was surprised to discover that the door handle was too hot to touch with anything but her jacket. The UFO then flew towards the west, casting its brilliant light higher into the atmosphere and exposing the arrival of 23 tandem-rotor helicopters that surrounded the object and appeared to escort it away. Witness descriptions of the helicopters matched the appearance of a U.S. Army CH-47 carrier. As the group continued to drive to Huffman, they watched the object and surrounding helicopters fly away for another 5 to 10 minutes. Mystified by what they just witnessed, the group continued their drive. Betty dropped off the Landrums and arrived back home just before 10 p.m. Within half an hour, her skin turned bright red and her eyes began burning and tearing up. Large blisters appeared over her face and skin. By morning, she was unable to eat anything without vomiting it up, and she was too sick even to leave her bed. She experienced severe headaches and diarrhea. By morning, her hair began falling out in patches. Her lips had swollen to 3 times their natural size, and her eyes were so swollen that they blocked her vision. The clock and radio in her car also failed to work following the incident. Vicki experienced nearly all of the same effects, albeit to a lesser degree, including 50% hair loss only on the side of her head that had faced the UFO. Colby had burns and blisters on his face, and severe diarrhea like the others. He had nightmares for weeks, and was unable to sleep alone for months. Vicki eventually talked Betty into going to a hospital in Houston, but all tests of her vital systems showed no indication of bodily malaise. She was sent home after 12 days in hospital with the expectation that she'd recover on her own, but it would be many weeks before all the symptoms would diminish. She later returned to the hospital for another 15 days. Only then did she tell her doctor about her strange encounter with the UFO. In the following months, a few corroborating witnesses stepped forward. Some of them also heard the helicopters, and at least one had seen them. However, all military personnel that were contacted about the incident denied any knowledge of activity in the area, and noted it would be extremely unlikely for so many helicopters to have flown inland, especially at that time of year. Vicki phoned the National UFO Reporting Center in Seattle to leave a witness deposition, and they, in turn, contacted the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization to send an investigator. A number of other UFO investigators also followed up on the case, including John Schuessler, founder of V.I.S.I.T, Dr. Leo Sprinkle of the University of Wyoming, and Alan Hendry, the lead investigator for J. Allen Hynek's independent research group, the Center for UFO Studies. After interviewing the witnesses and verifying their account of events, all three investigators endorsed the case as a genuine encounter with a UFO. On the advice of their senators, Betty and Vicky pursued legal action against the Air Force, eventually seeking $20 million in financial compensation. However, after several years of court appearances and legal battles, a district court judge dismissed the case for lack of evidence linking the UFO to the government or armed forces. The three witnesses never learned the identity or purpose of the strange craft. For the involvement of severe physiological reactions in the witnesses, the Cash-Landrum case is, at least on some level, impossible to deny. The three travelers saw something real that night, and it's hard to imagine anything natural that could account for the effects they experienced. Betty and Vicky stood by their account of events through several TV appearances and interviews in the years after the incident. Their case was profiled in the 1983 documentary The UFO Experience, and Vicky even volunteered to undergo hypnosis before a live TV audience. After 18 years of unrelenting health complications and endless medical bills, Betty passed away at the age of 71. Vicky died nearly a decade later, leaving Colby as the sole surviving witness. He is left with the undeniable memory of having encountered something unusual that night, without knowing if it was the product of a secret military project or some other source altogether.